The police are not here because someone broke into this cabin. They are here because the owner came home." Ethan Walker heard those words echo across the quiet shoreline as two patrol cars rolled onto the gravel driveway of his lake cabin. The morning had started like any other peaceful return to the place he had spent years protecting. The pine trees surrounding Lakewood Pines moved gently in the Michigan breeze. The water reflected the early sunlight, and for the first time in months, Ethan thought he could finally rest. Then he unlocked the front door. The moment he stepped inside, something felt wrong. The cabin that held years of family memories no longer looked like his own. A different coat hung by the entrance. Someone else's pictures decorated the walls. The furniture had been rearranged. On the kitchen counter sat a coffee mug with a name written across it. Brad. Ethan stood silently, taking in every detail. He wasn't angry. He wasn't confused. He was calculating. Because this wasn't a misunderstanding. Someone had made themselves comfortable inside a home they did not own. Before Ethan could make another call, a voice came from outside. "You need to step away from that property." Ethan turned and saw Karen Whitmore walking across the driveway with the confidence of someone who believed she controlled every inch of the neighborhood. For 15 years, Karen had been the president of the Lakewood Pines HOA. She knew every rule, every complaint, and every way to make people feel like they needed her approval. But she didn't know Ethan. Not really. She saw a quiet man in a simple jacket, standing beside an old pickup truck. She didn't see the owner of the cabin. She didn't see the person whose name was on the deed. "This is my property," Ethan said calmly. Karen smiled, as if she had already heard every excuse before. That's exactly what someone would say if they were trying to create a problem. Her words landed harder than she expected. Ethan looked toward the cabin window where a stranger's belongings were visible inside. "Who is staying here?" he asked. Karen didn't hesitate. "My friend Brad has permission." Permission. A single word that changed the entire atmosphere. Ethan looked back at the cabin he had bought after his father passed away. The place where his family gathered every summer. The place that represented years of hard work and memories. Karen lifted her phone. "I'm calling the police." Ethan didn't stop her. He simply watched. Because he knew something Karen didn't. Confidence was not the same as being right. And sometimes the person who looks the least powerful in the room is the one holding all the truth. Within minutes, the peaceful lake cabin became the center of a conflict nobody saw coming. Karen stood beside the driveway like she had already won. Brad remained inside the home like he belonged there. And Ethan Walker stood quietly in the middle, waiting for the moment when facts would finally speak louder than assumptions. The flashing lights from the police cars reflected across the calm surface of the lake, but Ethan Walker remained exactly where he was, standing on the gravel driveway of the cabin he had owned for more than a decade. He did not raise his voice. He did not argue with the crowd of neighbors gathering nearby. He simply watched as a story he never expected to hear began unfolding around him. Karen Whitmore stood several feet away, speaking with complete confidence, as if every word she said carried the weight of official authority. "I already explained the situation," she told the officers. "This man is claiming ownership, but my friend has been staying here with permission." Ethan looked at the cabin behind her, the place where he spent summers with his family, the place where his father taught him how to fish along the shoreline, the place he had carefully maintained, even during the years when work kept him away. To anyone passing by, Ethan looked like a man caught in a complicated neighborhood dispute. But Karen did not know the years behind that cabin. She only saw what she wanted to see, a quiet homeowner arriving unexpectedly, someone without a crowd of lawyers or a folder full of documents in his hands, someone she believed she could intimidate. "Karen," Ethan said calmly, "you know this is my property." She crossed her arms. "Then prove it." The challenge hung in the air. Several neighbors exchanged uncertain looks. Some had known Ethan for years, but rarely saw him because he only visited the cabin on weekends and holidays. Others had only heard Karen's version of events. That was the power Karen had built inside Lakewood Pines. She controlled the conversation before anyone had a chance to ask questions. Then Brad Mitchell stepped out from the cabin doorway. He looked comfortable, almost like he belonged there. "I have been taking care of this place," Brad said. Ethan studied him carefully. There was something strange about the way Brad spoke. Not like a guest, like someone who had convinced himself he had a right to be there. Karen quickly stepped beside him. "Brad has been looking after the property while Ethan was away." Ethan looked at her. Looking after it? He repeated. Or living in it? Nobody answered. The silence said more than words could. A young woman standing near the edge of the crowd watched everything unfold. Her name was Megan Collins. She had moved into Lakewood Pines 2 years earlier and worked in real estate. She knew how property records worked. She knew how ownership was documented. And she knew something about Ethan's cabin that nobody else seemed to remember. She had seen the public records. She had seen the name attached to that address, but she stayed quiet for the moment, watching as the truth slowly moved closer. Ethan reached into his truck and pulled out a small folder he had kept inside the glove compartment. Karen noticed it, but smiled. She still believed she had control of the situation. "Paperwork does not change what happened here," she said. Ethan looked at the cabin, then back at her. "No," he replied, "but the truth does." And for the first time that morning, Karen's confidence began to show a small crack. The folder in Ethan Walker's hand suddenly became the most important thing in the driveway. A few moments earlier, Karen Whitmore had controlled the entire conversation. She had spoken first, called the police first, and convinced the neighbors that she understood the situation better than anyone else. But now, for the first time, people were waiting to hear what Ethan had to say. Ethan opened the folder slowly. Inside were years of records, documents, and proof that told a story much different from the one Karen had created. He did not wave the papers around. He did not demand attention. He simply looked at the officer standing nearby and handed over the documents. "This cabin is registered in my name," Ethan said. "The property taxes, maintenance records, and ownership documents all match." The officer reviewed the paperwork carefully, while Karen watched from across the driveway. Her expression remained confident, but her posture had changed. She was no longer explaining the situation. She was waiting for someone else to speak for her. Brad Mitchell stepped forward. "Those documents do not explain why I was allowed to stay here," he said. Ethan turned toward him. "That is exactly what I want to understand." The question was simple, but it created a silence that nobody expected, because everyone realized something important. Brad was not explaining ownership. He was explaining access. Megan Collins, the young neighbor who had been quietly observing, finally stepped closer. "I think there is something everyone needs to know," she said. The group turned toward her. Karen immediately shook her head. "Megan, this does not involve you." But Megan did not step back. For months, she had watched how Karen operated around Lakewood Pines. She had seen small disagreements become major conflicts. She had seen residents hesitate to challenge HOA decisions because Karen always spoke with certainty. She had never expected to become part of one of those situations herself. "Actually, I think it does involve me," Megan said, "because I have worked with property records in this area, and I remember this address." Karen's eyes narrowed. "You are not an expert in this situation." Megan looked toward Ethan, then back at Karen. "I know enough to recognize that this cabin is not abandoned, and it is not available for someone else to claim." The neighbors began whispering among themselves. The story they had heard from Karen was starting to fall apart. Ethan looked at the cabin again. He remembered arriving there years earlier with a simple goal: to create a place where his family could return whenever life became overwhelming. He never imagined that one day he would have to stand outside and prove he belonged at his own home. But this was no longer just about a cabin. It was about what happened when someone used authority without accountability. Karen noticed the attention shifting away from her and tried to regain control. "Everyone needs to calm down," she said. "The HOA has rules for a reason." Ethan looked at her quietly. "Rules are meant to protect people, not to replace the truth." The officer closed the folder and looked between Karen and Ethan. The question was no longer whether Ethan belonged there. The question was how Karen had allowed someone else to take control of his property in the first place. The driveway at Lakewood Pines had become a place where every assumption was being tested. Karen Whitmore arrived that morning believing she had already written the ending of the story. Ethan Walker was supposed to be the confused homeowner. Brad Mitchell was supposed to be the trusted guest. And everyone else was supposed to accept her version without question. But now, standing among the neighbors, Karen felt the attention moving away from her. The documents in Ethan's folder had changed the atmosphere. The confidence she carried moments earlier was no longer as strong. "This is still an HOA matter," Karen said quickly, trying to bring the conversation back under her control. "The association has authority over situations like this." Ethan looked at her calmly. "Authority does not mean ownership. Those 5 words created a silence across the driveway. Nobody expected Ethan to challenge her. Not because he was aggressive, but because he was not playing the same game. Karen relied on pressure. Ethan relied on facts. Brad shifted his position near the cabin entrance. For the first time, he looked less like someone defending his home and more like someone waiting for a problem to disappear. Megan Collins noticed it immediately. She had spent years working with property listings and ownership records around Michigan's lake communities. She knew the difference between someone who belonged somewhere and someone who simply acted like they did. "I want to ask Brad something," Megan said. Everyone turned toward her. "When exactly did you move into this cabin?" Brad hesitated. "A few months ago." Megan nodded slowly. "And who gave you permission?" Brad glanced at Karen. It was a small movement, almost invisible, but everyone saw it. Ethan noticed too. The answer was becoming clearer without anyone saying it. Karen stepped forward. "This is unnecessary. Brad was helping maintain the property while Ethan was away." Megan looked directly at her. "Maintaining a property is not the same as living inside someone else's home." The neighbors became quieter. Some had known Karen for years. They had seen her enforce HOA rules, organize meetings, and make decisions with confidence. But confidence could hide mistakes. And sometimes the person who speaks the loudest is the person who does not want others looking closer. Ethan walked toward the edge of the driveway and looked across the lake. The view had always reminded him why he bought the cabin. Years ago, after losing his father, he wanted a place where memories could continue instead of ending. This cabin was not just wood, glass, and land. It was a promise he made to himself. Karen saw the emotional connection, but misunderstood it. She thought Ethan was simply attached to a vacation home. She did not understand that some places carry stories that cannot be measured by money. The officer reviewing the documents finally spoke. "Everything here appears consistent with Mr. Walker's ownership." Karen immediately responded, "But there has to be more to this." Ethan turned back toward her. "There is more," he said, "and that is what we need to find out." Megan looked toward the cabin window, then back at Karen. She remembered something she had noticed weeks earlier. A delivery receipt. A conversation. A detail that never made sense. She had ignored it because she did not want to get involved. But now she realized staying silent had allowed the situation to continue. "I think I know how Brad got access," Megan said quietly. The entire driveway went still. Karen's expression changed. Because for the first time, someone was not just questioning the situation. Someone was questioning her role in creating it. The moment Megan Collins said she knew how Brad Mitchell got access to the cabin, the entire driveway seemed to hold its breath. Karen Whitmore's confident expression changed instantly. It was not fear. It was the look of someone realizing that a story carefully controlled for months was starting to unravel. "What exactly are you talking about?" Karen asked. Her voice was sharper now, less like a neighborhood leader, and more like someone trying to stop a conversation before it went too far. Megan looked toward Ethan Walker. She could see that he was not trying to embarrass anyone. He was simply waiting for the truth to come out. "A few weeks ago, I saw Brad receiving packages here," Megan explained. "At first, I thought he was helping with maintenance, but then I noticed something strange. The delivery names, the timing, the way he talked about the cabin. It sounded like he believed he lived here." Brad quickly responded. "Karen told me everything was handled." That sentence landed differently than anything else he had said. Ethan looked at Karen. "Handled?" he repeated. Karen remained silent for a moment. Then she adjusted her tone. "You were never around. The cabin sat empty most of the year. Someone needed to make sure the property was taken care of." Ethan listened carefully. He had expected excuses. What surprised him was how easily Karen justified the situation. In her mind, she had created a solution. She had decided that because Ethan was not physically present every day, his connection to the property mattered less. But ownership was not based on who visited the most. It was based on truth. Megan stepped closer. "Karen, you know this was never about maintenance." The neighbors looked at each other. Some had heard rumors before. Small comments about Brad staying near the lake, conversations about an empty cabin. But nobody had connected the pieces. Ethan reached into his folder again and pulled out another document. "There is something else everyone should know." He handed it to the officer. "I contacted the county records office this morning. There have been no approved changes to my property registration. No transfer. No lease agreement. No authorization for another resident. Karen looked away for the first time. Ethan noticed. He remembered something his father once told him while they sat on the dock watching the sunset. People who know they are right do not need to rush the conversation. Those words stayed with him years later. That was why he never shouted. That was why he never tried to overpower anyone. The truth did not need volume, it needed patience. Brad stepped away from the cabin entrance. The confidence he had carried earlier was fading. He was no longer standing like someone who belonged there. He was standing like someone who realized questions were finally reaching him. Karen looked around at the neighbors who had once accepted every decision she made. Now they were asking their own questions. And that was the moment she lost the one thing she valued most: control of the story. Ethan closed the folder and looked toward the cabin. The problem was no longer hidden, but he knew this was only the beginning. Because if Karen had helped someone occupy his home, there was still one question left unanswered. Why did she think she could get away with it? The quiet confidence Ethan Walker carried that morning was not because he believed the situation would be easy. It was because he had learned something over the years. When people create a false story, they usually leave behind pieces of the truth. And now those pieces were beginning to appear. The driveway at Lakewood Pines remained crowded as neighbors watched the situation unfold. Karen Whitmore stood near the edge of the property, trying to maintain the image of someone who had everything under control. But the questions were no longer coming from Ethan. They were coming from everyone else. "Karen, how did Brad get access to the cabin?" one neighbor finally asked. The question seemed simple, but it carried the weight of everything people had ignored. Karen looked around before answering. "He was helping with the property," she said. "That is all." Ethan noticed the way she avoided specifics. No dates, no documents, no clear explanation. Just a general statement designed to sound reasonable. But reasonable was not the same as true. Ethan reached into his folder again and removed a printed email. "This was sent 3 months ago," he said. "A message from the HOA office discussing my cabin." Megan Collins stepped closer, recognizing the format immediately. It was an internal HOA communication. Karen's expression changed when she saw it. Ethan continued. "The message says the property was considered inactive because I was not physically present during the winter months." The neighbors exchanged looks. That was the first time many of them realized what had happened. Karen had not discovered a problem. She had created her own definition of one. Ethan looked directly at her. "You decided that because I was not here every day, someone else could step in." Karen responded quickly. "That is not what happened." "Then explain what did happen," Ethan said calmly. There was no anger in his voice. That made the moment more powerful. He was not trying to win an argument. He was allowing the facts to speak. Brad looked uncomfortable as the attention shifted toward him. "Karen told me the cabin was not being used," he said. "She said everything was approved." Megan immediately noticed the importance of those words. "Approved by who?" she asked. Brad did not answer. The silence was enough. The officer reviewing the information looked through the documents again. "Mr. Walker, do you have any records showing your communication with the HOA?" Ethan nodded. "Yes." He pulled out a series of emails showing maintenance requests, property payments, and previous conversations with the association. Every document told the same story. Ethan had never abandoned the cabin. He had never given up ownership. He had never authorized someone else to move in. Karen watched as the evidence built against her version of events. The same rules she used to pressure others were now being examined carefully. And for the first time, the neighborhood saw the difference between leadership and control. Ethan closed the folder. "I did not come here looking for a fight," he said quietly. "I came home." The words affected everyone standing there because they understood the deeper meaning. This was never just about a building beside a lake. It was about the feeling of having something taken away while people told you it was for your own good. Karen had spent months believing she was protecting the neighborhood. Now she had to face the possibility that she had protected the wrong person. And Ethan knew the next discovery would reveal exactly how far the situation had gone. The truth was no longer hidden inside documents. It was now standing in the open, surrounded by the people of Lakewood Pines, who had spent months believing only one version of the story. Karen Whitmore had built her reputation on knowing every rule, every procedure, and every detail of the neighborhood. But now those same details were revealing something she never expected. She had made decisions about a property that was never hers to control. Ethan Walker stood beside his truck, holding the same calm expression he had carried since he arrived. He looked at Karen, then at Brad Mitchell, and finally at the cabin behind them. "There is still one thing I want to understand," Ethan said. "Why did you believe you had the right to let someone stay here?" Karen looked away briefly. It was a small reaction, but everyone noticed. For years, she had been the person asking questions. Now she was the one being asked. Megan Collins opened her phone and reviewed the information she had saved. "I remember something else," she said. "A few months ago, Karen mentioned that the cabin was becoming a problem for the neighborhood because it was empty too often." Ethan turned toward her. "She said that?" Megan nodded. "Yes. She said the HOA needed to find a solution." The word solution carried a different meaning now. Because a solution should solve a problem that exists. It should not create a new one. The officer looked at Karen. "Did the HOA have any written agreement allowing Brad Mitchell to stay on this property?" Karen hesitated. That hesitation answered more than words could. Brad finally spoke. "I thought everything was approved." Ethan looked at him. "Who told you that?" Brad glanced at Karen again. The connection was impossible to ignore. Karen had not simply overlooked what happened. She had been involved from the beginning. The neighbors began discussing what they had just learned. Some remembered seeing Brad around the cabin. Others remembered Karen mentioning concerns about unused properties. Suddenly, small moments that seemed unrelated started forming a much larger picture. Ethan walked toward the cabin steps. He ran his hand along the wooden railing, remembering when he first bought the property. Back then, it was not the biggest cabin on the lake. It was not the most expensive, but it was meaningful. He had spent weekends repairing small things, planting trees near the shoreline, and creating a place where future generations of his family could return. Karen had looked at the cabin as an empty space on a map. Ethan saw it as a part of his life. "You made a decision about my home because you thought I was not watching," Ethan said. "But being away does not mean someone disappears." The statement stayed in the air. Karen tried one final time to defend herself. "I was trying to protect property values." Ethan looked at her. "Protecting a community does not mean ignoring the rights of the people who live there." The officer closed his notebook and exchanged a glance with Megan. The situation had changed completely. This was no longer a misunderstanding between neighbors. It was a matter of someone using a position of influence to cross a line that should never have been crossed. Karen looked around at the people who once followed her instructions without question. Now they were watching her differently. Ethan knew the next step was not about proving he owned the cabin. That was already clear. The next step was uncovering the full story of how far Karen had gone to make someone else feel like they belonged in a place that was never theirs. The morning sun continued to rise over Lakewood Pines, but the feeling around the cabin had completely changed. Hours earlier, Karen Whitmore had stood in that same driveway believing she had the final word. She believed the HOA title on her name gave her control. She believed confidence could replace evidence. But now, every question, every document, and every unanswered moment had created a different picture. Ethan Walker stood quietly while the officer reviewed the information one more time. There was no celebration on his face, no satisfaction from seeing someone else struggle. Ethan was not there to destroy Karen. He was there to restore what had been taken from him. Megan Collins looked through the notes on her phone and remembered one more detail. "There is something else," she said. Everyone turned toward her again. "Last month, I saw Karen and Brad together near the cabin. They were discussing changes to the property." Karen immediately responded. "That does not prove anything." Megan nodded. "No, but the messages might." The driveway became silent. Karen's expression changed. "What messages?" Megan looked at Ethan. She had saved several public HOA announcements and conversations related to neighborhood decisions. Among them were messages discussing concerns about unused properties and plans to place temporary residents in certain locations. Ethan listened carefully. He was not surprised that Karen had made decisions behind the scenes. He was surprised by how comfortable she had become making them. The officer asked Karen a direct question. "Were you aware that Mr. Walker had not given permission for Brad Mitchell to stay here?" Karen paused. For the first time, she did not answer immediately. That pause was louder than any explanation. Brad looked frustrated. "You told me this was approved," he said. Karen turned toward him, but the trust between them had already disappeared. The person who thought she was protecting the neighborhood had ended up putting someone else in the middle of a situation he did not fully understand. Ethan looked at the crowd of neighbors. Some had their arms crossed. Others looked disappointed. Many had spent years believing Karen always knew best. But leadership was not about being the loudest person in the room. It was about accepting responsibility when things went wrong. This community deserves better than decisions made without transparency, Ethan said. Nobody argued, because everyone understood the meaning behind those words. Karen had not simply made a mistake. She had created a system where people trusted her authority without asking enough questions, and now that system was being examined. Later that afternoon, the Lakewood Pines HOA board held an emergency meeting. The same residents who once avoided challenging Karen's decisions now wanted answers. Records were reviewed, conversations were examined. The details showed a pattern of poor judgment and unauthorized actions. Karen sat quietly as the board members discussed what had happened. The position she once used as proof of importance was now the reason people were asking for accountability. Ethan attended the meeting, but he did not demand revenge. He did not ask for humiliation. He simply asked for the rules to apply equally to everyone. By the end of the meeting, Karen Whitmore stepped down from her role as HOA president. Brad Mitchell agreed to leave the cabin and return control of the property to Ethan. The home beside the lake was finally quiet again. But the biggest change was not the cabin. It was the neighborhood itself. People began asking more questions. They began listening before judging. And they finally understood that respect should never depend on who has the loudest voice. Ethan walked back onto his property that evening and looked across the water. The place that once felt uncertain finally felt like home again. The morning after everything changed at Lakewood Pines, Ethan Walker returned to the cabin before sunrise. For the first time in weeks, the property felt peaceful again. The quiet sound of the water moving along the shore, the soft wind through the trees, and the familiar wooden steps leading to the front door reminded him why this place mattered so much. It was never just a cabin. It was a place filled with memories, family traditions, and moments that could not be replaced. Ethan stood on the porch for a moment, looking across the lake. He thought about everything that had happened, not just the confusion, the questions, or the documents. He thought about the lesson hidden inside it all. A person could lose control of a situation without ever losing the truth. Karen Whitmore had spent years believing that influence came from having the final word. She believed rules gave her power. She believed people would always accept her decisions because she sounded certain. But Ethan learned something different. Real strength was not about controlling the room. It was about staying calm when everyone else expected you to break. Over the next few weeks, Lakewood Pines began to change. The HOA board introduced new procedures to make decisions more transparent. Residents were encouraged to ask questions instead of simply accepting announcements. Meetings became less about authority and more about communication. The community that once felt divided slowly began rebuilding trust. Megan Collins continued helping neighbors understand property records and local regulations. She often thought about the day she decided to speak up. She almost stayed silent. She almost convinced herself it was not her problem, but she realized that ignoring the truth only allowed confusion to continue. Ethan appreciated what Megan had done, but he always told her the same thing. "You did not help me because I owned the cabin. You helped because you knew what was right." Those words stayed with her. Months later, Ethan hosted a small gathering at the cabin. Neighbors who had once stood across the driveway, unsure of what to believe, now sat together by the lake. There were conversations, laughter, and a feeling that the community had finally moved forward. Nobody talked about Karen with anger. Nobody needed to. The lesson had already been learned. A person's confidence can create an illusion of power, but the truth eventually has a way of becoming impossible to ignore. Ethan looked around the cabin that evening and remembered the day he arrived to find someone else living inside his home. He remembered the feeling of standing there, while others questioned whether he belonged. But he also remembered the way he responded. He did not let frustration decide his actions. He let patience guide him. Because sometimes justice does not arrive with a dramatic moment. Sometimes it arrives quietly, through documents, honesty, and people willing to stand for what is right. Ethan closed the cabin door that night knowing something important. A home is not protected by who speaks the loudest. A community is not strengthened by who controls the most. In the end, everything comes back to one simple truth. Respect is earned through integrity, and the truth always knows the way home.